Okay, so we've got 3 learning objectives here in part 2. The first is to appreciate the unique metabolic demands of skeletal muscle and how those demands change with different types of skeletal muscle. So we're going to start there and talk about how muscle gets its energy. So skeletal muscle metabolism, basically how do cells generate ATP? And then also we're going to talk about the type of skeletal muscle fibers. And these 2 topics go hand in hand because the type of skeletal muscle fiber really dictates how that muscle will get its source of ATP to power contractions. So we know this already. ATP is our body's currency as far as cellular work. So ATP is required by muscles in order to do work. More specifically, ATP is what generates the power stroke. So we talked about the ATP binding to myosin head and actually generating the shortening during cross-bridge cycles. The mechanism for making that ATP is going to differ depending on how that muscle will endure contractions. And then want to think about how the muscle will be named differently. So depending on the source of ATP for muscles, that will determine how that muscle is named and what type of muscle that is. So here are our 3 main sources of ATP production. So in order to power muscle contractions, we can phosphorylate ADP by way of creatine phosphate. We will speak about this first source of ATP initially. This is a transient source of making ATP. And you want to think about this as the initial phase of the contraction. So when a muscle first begins to contract, it's always going to make ATP by way of the creatine phosphate system. So by way of phosphorylating ADP, by taking a phosphate off of another molecule called creatine phosphate. All right. The other 2 sources of making ATP, which are oxidative phosphorylation in the mitochondria. This should sound very familiar to us, right? The electron transport chain, the mitochondrial membrane, oxidative phosphorylation. This is another way of making a substantial amount of ATP. And then the third mechanism is anaerobic glycolysis. This is where we make ATP in a more convenient way. So this is a more convenient way to make ATP, but it's a smaller amount of ATP. And in order to generate ATP by anaerobic glycolysis, we can do so in the absence of oxygen. So think about these 2 terms, oxidative meaning that oxygen is required, whereas anaerobic glycolysis means that we can do so in the absence of oxygen, but then there's going to be a price to pay for making ATP in the absence of oxygen. That's going to result in some lactate buildup, okay, or lactic acid buildup. So just to reiterate here, we've got 3 ways to make ATP for muscle. The first one is always going to be used. That's a transient or a temporary source just to get the contraction going, get the contraction started. And that's the creatine phosphate system. The other 2 mechanisms are going to be more sustainable. Oxidative phosphorylation is going to require oxygen. It's going to make a lot of ATP. And aerobic glycolysis is not going to require oxygen. It is going to result in lactic acid buildup, but the drawback is that it's going to generate a smaller amount of ATP. So let's start with that first mechanism, the creatine phosphate system. So the role of this system is to get the contraction started. When you start muscle contractions at rest, there's a small amount of ATP that's really just on tap, that's really just standing by, ready to go. And because muscle contractions start instantaneously, there needs to be a source of ATP that's just standing by, ready to give that energy in order to get the contraction started. So the way that this goes is that creatine phosphate is on the left of our equation here, along with ADP in the unphosphorylated form. Using the help of the enzyme creatine kinase, we can convert this to creatine on the right of our equation along with ATP in the phosphorylated form. So the law of mass action says that we're going to use the more abundant substrates. So on the side of the equation that we have the most abundant substrates, that is going to determine what direction we drive the equation in. So let's say we have a lot of ATP. We already have a lot of ATP built up. We're going to drive the equation to the left, and we're going to generate creatine phosphate and the unphosphorylated ADP. On the other end, if we're contracting muscle, right, if the muscle is being contracted, we're going to drive ATP down because we're using up that ATP. Muscle is actively contracting. ATP levels drop. ADP levels rise. So we have more of our substrates on the left. And then we drive the equation in the opposite direction so that we can make more of this ATP and have it on tap, have it standing by ready to power contractions to begin those contractions initially. Okay, so by this mechanism of making a small amount of temporary ATP, we can supply enough ATP to generate 5 times the resting quantities of ATP in muscle. So basically, we can start the contraction with enough ATP to get things warmed up. Now, after we get the contractions warmed up, now we have an opportunity to decide between the other 2 mechanisms or methods of generating ATP, and that is going to be determined by how that muscle is being used, what type of muscle we're looking at, and what type of intensity we're using that muscle with, what type of exercise is being conducted. So we'll start with the oxidative phosphorylation. This is usually when we have light to moderate intensity exercise. So in terms of practical activities, think about taking a walk, think about some light house cleaning, think about maybe walking up a flight of stairs, anything that you can do where you can maintain your rate of respiration, where you can maintain your rate of breathing. So maybe even a light walk on a treadmill, or maybe even some light weightlifting. Those moderate intensity activities can be sustained by way of oxidative phosphorylation. And it's really because we can maintain the rate of respiration. So in order to start this, we will tap into any glycogen stores. So any glycogen that is being stored, we can tap into those until those have been exhausted. And those can go up to 30 minutes. Then we can use any glucose or fatty acids that are circulating in the blood, okay? And then beyond that, if we can maintain respiration, we can bring in enough oxygen to increase the power to those muscles to where they can make ATP via oxidative phosphorylation. Remember, oxidative phosphorylation needs oxygen. So in order to keep muscles using oxidative phosphorylation, we have to be bringing in enough oxygen through respiration in order to keep the oxygen supply steady. So what happens here? We increase our rate of ventilation, we increase our heart rate and the contractility of the heart, and then we dilate blood vessels so that more blood can flow to the muscles and it can deliver more of that oxygen that's coming in to those muscles as well. And then the other thing that's important in this phase is that we have increase in GLUT4 receptors. If you remember what GLUT4 receptors were, we talked about these earlier on. They're basically receptors in the membrane that allow us to uptake and utilize glucose. So the cells in our body have these GLUT4 receptors that allow us to uptake glucose and be able to use that to begin metabolizing to make energy. So increase or upregulation or inserting more of those GLUT4 receptors into cells will just allow for us to uptake more of that glucose and generate more oxygen, okay? Or more ATP, excuse me. So in terms of looking at the graph, so we've got our energy used per source, we've got time, and notice that we start with the creatine phosphate system. So in the first couple minutes of light intensity exercise. We're going to tap into whatever we have on tap, whatever we have standing by way of the creatine phosphate system, and that's just going to get the contractions started spontaneously. Then, if it's moderate or light exercise and we can maintain our rate of ventilation or rate of respiration, we're going to tap into anaerobic glycolysis for a short period of time. That is going to help us utilize whatever we have in store, whether that's any glycogen that's being stored up, whether we have glucose or fatty acids circulating in the blood. We're going to tap into those for a short period, up to 30 minutes. And then what is going to take over, what's going to be the main source of sustaining light intensity exercise is oxidative phosphorylation. And as we keep our rate of ventilation steady, we're going to see the rate of oxidative phosphorylation gradually rise until it is the main source of generating ATP to keep that type of exercise going. Let's look at heavy intensity exercise. So here is where we have much more demand to our muscles, more than we can actually maintain our rate of ventilation to keep up with. So think about heavy lifting, right? If you're a power lifter in the gym and you're lifting really heavy weights or doing, really vigorous exercise, maybe some jumping jacks, or maybe some powerful squats, right? You're lifting a lot of weight, and now your muscles require a lot more ATP than you can keep up with through your rate of respiration. So the muscles now are going to have to tap into anaerobic glycolysis as a way to sustain these contractions, because your rate of ventilation is not able to match the demand of what the muscles require. So here again, we start with creatine phosphate, right? To keep that, start that contraction, right? We use whatever is on tap. And then we begin with anaerobic glycolysis that spikes steeply to start. Notice that oxidative phosphorylation is going to increase initially as well. So we are generating a faster rate of breathing, right? Even if you're lifting heavy or your muscles are under higher demand, you're still going to try to keep up through your rate of ventilation. You're still going to try to bring in more oxygen to match that ATP demand, but it's not going to be enough. So what's going to take over is the anaerobic glycolysis, where we can make more ATP, okay? And when I say more here, I mean in addition to whatever's being made through oxidative phosphorylation, but it's not enough to sustain it on its own. So anaerobic glycolysis, we generate some ATP in conjunction with what we can generate through oxidative phosphorylation, and that is what keeps the contractions going. The price to pay for anaerobic glycolysis, however, is the buildup of lactate. So in order to make ATP without matching that with oxygen, we have to shuttle some of that off via lactate dehydrogenase. That pyruvate gets converted into lactate, and we build that up as lactic acid. This is why we have that burn, that intensive burn that we feel in the muscles as a result of doing more heavy intensity exercise. Okay, so when you start to lift really heavy weights, eventually you'll begin to feel that burn in your muscles as a result of the acid that's being built up by way of anaerobic glycolysis.